Spring is around the corner, which is one of Japan's largest tourism seasons. The cherry blossoms will be in full bloom, the weather will be nice, and most importantly, the borders will be open for the first spring since Japan's border closures began. So, I'm here to talk about the cheapest ways to travel around Japan. A lot of this depends on how far you plan on traveling and how long you plan on staying in Japan, so I will break this video into sections by travel distance. To get us started, let's talk about multi-region travel. This is the longest travel distance. This assumes you want to visit multiple cities in various regions across Japan. So let's talk about the JR Rail Pass. If Japan was Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, then this is the golden ticket for exploring Japan. The JR Rail Pass is basically an all-you-can-eat buffet, but for transportation. You can select a time frame of 7, 14, or 21 days, and within that time, you can use almost any Shinkansen, subway, some buses, and even some ferry boats. This pretty much covers all traveling around Japan and means you can get anywhere you'd like to go. The JR Rail Pass has two types, a green or an ordinary pass. This is just the difference between riding first-class cars or regular train cars. The prices you see now are the prices you would pay if you bought the pass in Japan. It's actually a little cheaper if you order the pass online and have the exchange order mailed to you. Then, after you land in Japan, you visit a kiosk or help desk to exchange for the actual pass itself. Keep in mind, and this is very important, this pass is not available if you are a resident of Japan. So, if you live in Japan, like me, you cannot use this pass. This is actually a super common practice in Japan. There are a lot of travel passes that are only available to tourists. I imagine this isn't relevant for most people watching this video, but it's still worth mentioning. If you want more information, I'll leave a link to the official website in the description of this video. Before we move on, I think it's worth mentioning a good app to pair with the JR Rail Pass. Japan Travel is an app I've used before and highly recommend. It shows you various routes for different travel methods, but most importantly, it allows you to filter by the pass you are using. So while this pairs nicely with something like the JR Rail Pass, you can also use it for any other pass you may have. It will give you options for walking, taking a taxi, a bus, subway, Shinkansen, virtually any method of transportation to get you where you need to go and the cost breakdown along the way. Then it shows you the exact route you need to take. I used this when I traveled to Tokyo for the first time using the JR East Pass, and I can't recommend it enough. So the JR Rail Pass is what I would consider the best option for traveling around Japan. I understand that some people may not want to travel that far though. So let's talk about long to medium travel distance. This assumes you will maybe visit a few cities that are relatively close to each other. For example, the popular Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka route. The Shinkansen is still worth mentioning here, especially if you're trying to save time. However, it wouldn't be your cheapest option. So if you can spare the time, I recommend thinking about the Japan Bus Pass. This is purchased from Wheeler Express and comes at a reasonable price. Much like the Japan Rail Pass, it's separated by days of use, except these do not have to be consecutive. They're also broken down into two different types of passes. The cheaper being a weekday pass versus an all-day pass. The difference is roughly 2,500 yen, or right now about 20 USD. Definitely check out their website for more information. I'll leave the link in the description. There are some caveats to using the bus pass, so just make sure you are informed before purchasing. The Shinkansen compared to the Japan Bus Pass would be more than double the cost just to get from city A to city B and back. If you did any more local traveling during that time, then the Japan Bus Pass becomes an even greater value. Keep in mind that any time you ride a Shinkansen without a special pass, you're typically paying 100 USD or more one way. A good example is a round trip from Tokyo to Kyoto is almost the exact same cost as a 7-day JR Rail Pass. So it's really hard to recommend a Shinkansen outside of special passes for this reason, especially if we're talking about cost efficiency. There are region-based rail passes that might be worth looking at depending on your budget. I don't want to focus on these too much though, since this video is about saving money and not time. But I will leave a link in the description about the various rail passes, and you can decide if it's worth it for you or not. Flights are also worth mentioning here as well. Domestic flights in Japan are pretty competitive, but the prices can vary pretty heavily, so it just depends on when you decide to travel and where you need to go. A good example I found is a flight from Sendai to Osaka for about 5,000 yen one way. Oh, this is about 38 USD right now. So depending on your situation, this can save you some serious time and money. But moving on to the last section, let's talk about short to medium travel distance. This assumes you're probably just staying in one city or maybe visiting a neighboring city nearby. Your best options within this category are going to be subways, buses, taxis, or just walking. Subways and buses are super cost-effective ways for traveling intercity. Depending on distance traveled and your location, I've seen subway tickets go from anywhere between 100 yen to about 350 yen. The price goes up the further you need to take the subway. Buses are usually a flat rate, especially if you're in the 23 wards of Tokyo. You can expect to pay around 200 yen or so for a bus ride. Depending on how far you need to go, maybe a little more. But something else worth mentioning here are bikes. But the prices on these can vary a lot depending on where you're at in Japan, so it's best to research bike rental costs in whichever city you plan on staying at. They usually charge you every 30 minutes of use up until a point where they just charge you for a day fee. This usually occurs after a few hours of use. You could reasonably expect to pay about 500 to 2,000 yen a day for a bike rental. It just depends on your location and the company you decide to work with. Japan also has tried implementing e-scooters in the past, but unsuccessfully. They've gained a little traction since then. A popular company called LUP has most of the market share for e-scooters in Tokyo currently. So you may see these around, but it's still not something I could recommend yet. As of right now, they're classified as a form of motorcycle, meaning you are required to have a Japanese driver's license to operate one. However, in July of 2023, this will no longer be the case, and you will just need to be over the age of 16 and wear a helmet. So, depending on when you watch this video, an e-scooter might be an affordable option for you. But just like bikes, the rental prices depend on the area you're in, and honestly, it's not a popular option outside of big cities yet, but I still thought it would be worth mentioning. There are also taxis, which I assume everyone is already familiar with. They operate the same way in Japan as you're probably used to, but there is a popular app called Japan Taxi that I recommend for finding taxis if it's an option you're interested in. You can set up your pickup location and drop-off location. If you're familiar with apps like Uber, then it's pretty much the same, but Uber isn't really popular in Japan, so I recommend using the Japan Taxi app instead. The fees range based on distance traveled, but it's safe to say you can expect to pay at least 1,200 to 1,500 yen as a base rate, and then it will go up from there. Just remember that this is Japan, so English is limited, and you will most likely need to type, kanji, or read some of it. Hopefully this isn't a surprise to anyone, and if it's ever an issue, I just recommend taking a subway and walking. But I wanted to mention this method because it can be cost efficient depending on where you need to go, and also convenient if you decide to drink a little too much and want to get home as quickly as possible. And finally, there's walking. I don't really think I need to cover the cost of walking. I think you can figure that one out yourself. But for this final category, I just recommend using the subway and walking wherever you need to go. I'd say most of the time this is the most cost efficient method. The closest behind that is probably taking a taxi. Just don't ever take a taxi to or from an airport. The prices get jacked up and they're very expensive. Just take the subway. But that's all from this video. Hopefully you learned something. Stay safe and happy travels.